This is Beatrice Mady, the director of the Fine Arts Gallery at St. Peter's University. We are pleased to present James Pustorino, Sound of a Star. Jim is a multi-talented artist, curator, arts organizer, and director of the Drawing Rooms in Jersey City. Trained at Carnegie Mellon University, his focus was on printmaking, drawing, and painting. He has exhibited throughout the United States. This will be his third solo exhibit in New Jersey in the past 2 years. He is a recent recipient of a New Jersey Council on the Arts Fellowship for Painting. Let's now see the work and hear Jim talk about his large-scale compositions.
The concept Sound of a Star is itself something of a paradox. Yes, stars do make sounds, but no, since the sound can't travel through the vacuum of space, we can't hear them. To take the paradox or the contradiction further, the title suggests that the work is a depiction or representation of sound. I like this notion of the sort of semi-impossible puzzle. It emphasizes or goes well with how I structure these paintings. They are not planned out. I build them piece by piece, one part responding to the other, and it often feels very much like an impossible puzzle to get everything to work together and to create a composition that has a tension and that also holds together. This idea of everything about to fall apart or about to come together, the notion of building order from chaos, is integral to the work. Myth. This is one of the earliest pieces in the series. I think it was done the same time as the first one, but it became the second one. This is Light Like Sound. Myth is the engine for all the work. Myth makes it a series. Myth drives the content, the form, the choice of color. The myth is that ideal that seems greater than ourselves, but comes from ourselves in response to the world around us. The artwork seeks to embody the myth and relate the sense of myth to the people who encounter it. This happens both in the making of the artwork and in the viewing. So in this piece, Light Like Sound, the struggle and the energy of making the work is evident in the form of the actual painting. Math. This is the first picture in the series. This is called How Will I Know Light from Darkness? I remind myself to keep math in mind while I'm making these works. And at the same time, math keeps presenting itself and needing to be dealt with. How does math present itself? First, we have the overarching concept of math as it relates to our understanding of the space we live in, especially the celestial or cosmic space the theme refers to. Trying to envision or imagine events in a curved grid is just one aspect of geometry I encounter. Another is the forms that I create and how they intersect. The very first decision that must be made for any of these pieces is the proportions. The size and the height to width ratio dictate much of what these paintings will become. Music. This is the fifth painting in the series, Cacophonic. As I develop the composition, I build larger and smaller movements, and I consider the rhythm of the colors. I often think of the colors as notes that have specific sounds. The composition works when these are all in balance or harmony. Memory. This is the fourth picture in the series. It's called Flare. Memory is the catch-all. Memory is on this list because I have to remind myself to remember, to search my mind as well as all my source materials for elements I can build into these works, or inspirations to solve compositional puzzles. It's important to me that I not only rely on painting language, the visual language of art history, but also on all the images of popular culture that I've encountered from childhood till now. I hope this allows me to create a rich and genuine expression of my experience. This is Light Invincible. It was the second to last one in the series. It's the only one that became a vertical. Many of them did turn around as I worked on them. This one is called Waves of a Circle. Movement. This is Sowing Wind to Reap the Whirlwind. This is the last piece in the series. The first way I consider movement as an element in this body of work is my own movement. My hand, my arm, the action of drawing that starts off each of these pieces. I'm usually working with colored pencils, and the tracing of these first movements in pencil gets built into forms as I develop the piece. But there's another aspect of movement, and that is setting these individual movements in place so that a sense of movement is happening within the composition. In this painting, Sowing Wind to Reap the Whirlwind, I'm building opposing, directional, curving forms that are pulling against each other and are countered by radiating lines of color that become an undercurrent. A further element of movement I consider but can't completely tie down is the illustration or depiction of movement that takes place along with the compositional movement. This piece was one of the few for which I came up with the title first, and the challenge was to make an arrangement that would embody the whirlwind. Italo Calvino was a very inventive, imaginative Italian fiction writer. Calvino did a series of lectures at Harvard where he outlined 6 values or qualities of literature and explains how some of his favorite writers use them. As it turned out, Calvino died before he could give the 6th lecture, so we only have the 5. I thought about how I could incorporate these into my own work, and this resulted in the Cosmic Strip series several years ago. When I was planning the Star of a Sound series and working on paintings that led up to them, I began to find that I needed my own principles. I started scrawling some ideas, and these ended up being codified into a list that, like a recipe, I could refer to while I was making the new works. This is the current series I'm working on. This is where I work at home. And I have one big wall, and I usually start on the floor. This is Denril. As you see, you can see through it for the most part. It's a film. It sort of works like an animation cell, and it gives the work a different sort of structure or layering. There's a piece of plexi over here, big piece of plexi on the floor. Gives it a smooth line when you draw on it. Just have a bunch of items I work with. Sometimes I have a piece up on the wall that's recent. This sort of keeps me sort of focused. On this side of the room, I have a table set up. I've got all my pencils and odds and ends and junk. A lot of times as I'm working, I keep books around. This is a book on the history of painting, which it's very inclusive and exhaustive about at least most of what was going on in Europe and America from the 1800s into all through the 20th century. It gives a little synopsis of a lot of different kind of works. I also keep this book around, which I've had probably since I was 12 or so. It's a history of the comic strip. It's again a really well laid out sort of a survey of all kinds of both French and American comic strips from the early 1900s. And I get a lot of ideas about how to use black and white and how to use graphic forms. It's something I've had a long time. This book over here is one of the few books that it's more recent acquisition, but I really look at the Kuniyoshi book pretty often. These are Japanese woodcuts, and I just feel like they have something to do with how I'm using form and how I'm using space, and the idea of the small detail in the calligraphy that works against, you know, this larger form, and how the larger form is filled with smaller shapes. I look at this pretty often as I'm working. Gives me some new input. These are more books I sometimes just keep in the bedroom so I can look at them every once in a while, like when I'm reading Relativity. It's hard to read, but you get some ideas out of it. This is the Calvino book, the 6 Memos. Sometimes I pull out some sketches to work from. The sketches really they don't become a painting necessarily. They're sort of in their own scale, and they're more explore what you can do with drawing, but I take some of that and move it over into the paintings as well. So for what I'm doing now, I pulled these out, and these actually have been around a few years. This series, this is about 5 or 6 paintings after the set that we're showing. This is the Time Flower series. They start to get a little different. I wanted to be a little looser. I wanted to use the space a little more, especially the open white space, and more changing the graphic forms. Again, even on this one, I'm adding forms that are more rounded and curves, and this one has a long way to go, but it's getting started.